How can you develop your management skills against the backdrop of COVID-19? Hello, my name is Robin Erickson, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to this edition of Off the Shelf, a book discussion series brought to you by the Conference Board. Today, I will be sitting down with Deb Cohen to discuss her latest book, Developing Management Proficiency, a Self-Directed Learning Approach, and how it's relevant during today's COVID-19 crisis. I'm excited to be here with Dr. Deb Cowan. She is a management and HR expert. She's also a distinguished principal research fellow here at the Conference Board. She is a speaker, a trainer, a consultant with 15 years of experience as a business school professor and 15 years as an executive with the Society for HR Management. On a personal note, Deb has been my partner writing an article here at the Conference Board on alternative credentialing, which should be published later this year. As most of you know, there is a plethora of management books. I spent over 20 years as a management consultant, so I should know. When I read Deb's book, I actually texted her late at night to say that I couldn't believe that a university professor had written it, as it reads like a practical how-to guide for managers instead of as a dusty academic book. We are all living through a global pandemic these days, and it is an unprecedented time. I think that Deb's book has many relevant lessons for all managers who want to be better at their jobs and for people aspiring to be a manager. This book focuses on how anyone, individual contributor, new manager, or senior manager, can improve their management skills. So Deb, my first question is, given the current pandemic environment, why should people take the time now to think about their management skills?
Thanks, Robin. That's a great question, and thank you for that lovely introduction. But it's a great question to start with because management skills, you tend to think, or people tended to think about planning, organizing, and controlling. But today, we know that management skills are much more important than that in terms of the array of competencies that they need. So things like building relationships, collaboration, empowering others, goal setting, listening, motivating. All of these kinds of things are very behavioral in orientation, and they go beyond some of those traditional planning, organizing, and so forth. And when we're called upon to do this, whether it's face-to-face or virtual, I would argue that those skills are even more critical today because we have a lot of newness in our environment. So people are forced to do virtual interaction as opposed to that being an option oftentimes. And so my sense is that while emotions are running very high right now, people are stressed, they're uncertain about the future. And as a result, the better their management proficiency needs to be in order to be equipped to handle the twists and the turns that we're encountering, not just in the coming months, but I would argue in the coming years. And so I think we need to be much more effective in how we handle work. We think about workload, interactions, and everything else that the business environment is throwing at us. So it's certainly true that we need to be as good as we can be at weathering these turbulent times. And there was an interesting research report that was published last year called something like a trust barometer by Edelman. And in that research, they found that 75% of employees trusted their employer. And this was a pretty solid increase, I think, from the previous year. So what's important, or what this says to me, is that employees are turning to their organizations for support and for guidance. They're not just looking at social platforms and the news media. And so today, more than ever, and to your point, whether you're a new manager, an experienced manager, or an individual contributor, we need to focus on our management skills. And it's something that I think we can do as we are living through this incredible time right now.
Deb, I agree with you. And that 2019 Edelman Trust Barometer talks about how most employees trust their companies more than they trust the government. So I completely agree that this concept is really important right now, and that I do think that there are some people who have some extra time and that they would really benefit from your book. And my next question for you is about that exactly, because your book is different from all the other management books because it provides worksheets, figures, and tables that allow people to start from wherever they're at. So tell the audience how someone could just pick up this book and start using it immediately.
Absolutely. So my intent in writing this book was to create something that was both useful and user friendly. There's a lot of research out there that supports the notion that adults, that all of us, we learn by doing and by participating in the process. And so I wanted to include a lot of worksheets and hands-on assessments and tables and things that would be essentially takeaways that people could use, right away. So here's an example. One of the first chapters in the book is about self-assessment. And in this chapter, I've included a list of 50 competencies or skills that are important for success. Certainly it's not an exhaustive list of all of the skills and competencies that are out there, but it's pretty comprehensive. And the reader is asked to do two things. And this is an example of two of the worksheets. So first, you're asked to assess your skill and competency on a 5-point scale of all of those 50 competencies, meaning that there's an opportunity here for people to be completely honest. Nobody's going to see this but you. You're the only one that's going to look at that. So it's an opportunity to certainly do that and to be honest. The second worksheet in that chapter asks the reader to take that same list of competencies and assign an importance value for each competency, both now and then in a second column in the next 12 months. The reality is that our jobs change all the time. We get new assignments, colleagues enter or exit, and things may be changing. Priorities may be changing, both in your organization and in your personal life. And that's certainly very true today. So let's take an example, empathy. A month ago, empathy was certainly important to you as a manager, but today that same skill may be far more important. And so, how do you deal with sympathy if that is required? Build a rapport in a very different fashion, perhaps, than if you were face to face. Show appreciation, show understanding. All of those things that fit with empathy are things that a manager has to do. Let's take that example a step further and think about what's happening in our lives today and at this very moment. So someone who considers themselves maybe an effective collaborator, they might need to revise their estimation based upon different dynamics. A good collaborator maybe always be a good collaborator, but when you're moved to this entirely virtual environment rather than face to face, you have different organizational priorities, it may take developing those skills to be more effective. So, your management skills, it's really going to be what help get you through this. And so what I've tried to do in the book is provide lots of worksheets to help with this. And one final point before we move to the next question is that this, I think, is also going to be helpful to people who are in transition. So whether you're in transition in your own organization right now in terms of how you do things, some people may find themselves in the unfortunate position of being in transition because they've had to be laid off from their job. And so now, as we go forward, there's going to be a whole lot more competition. We know unemployment is going to be pretty high. And so because of this new competition, anything we can do right now to strengthen our management skills is going to be important. We really can't wait to develop these.
Thank you, Deb. I think those are really good points. And I think the reminder of the fact that we're in a global crisis was amplified during your response simply because there was a siren in the background and there's just no getting away from that at this point in our lives. And so, obviously we've all had our lives turned upside down by this practice. And I think that one of the topics that you talk about is really important for this approach that you've gone through, which is the concept of self-directed learning. So what is that for those who haven't heard that phrase before, and why is it important to the topic of improving management skills?
Absolutely. Self-directed learning, it's a process where a person takes the initiative to identify what their learning needs are, forming some learning goals for themselves, identifying resources, selecting the way they apply those resources. And it's really about taking control. But the good news here is that while learning is maybe directed by the individual in this scenario, it doesn't mean that learning has to be accomplished without the help of others. And it certainly doesn't mean that you're not continuing to partner with your organization, to help you. So simply put, I think self-directed learning is where the individual thinks more intentfully about their learning and development, and they take it on at a basic level. We're all curious. We read, we search for information, and we attempt to apply that information. But self-directed learning is really, I think of it as being on a continuum. And the higher you go, the more sophisticated you become in your pursuit of your own development. So having, again, that intent, creating a learning agenda can be helpful in integrating what you learn. So let's take for an example, again, what we're dealing with right now. Let's say you're thrown into a situation where your entire staff is now remote rather than perhaps some working at home sometimes and some in the office. As a manager, how do you learn what you need to know to engage those workers, evaluate their performance, communicating to them as a group and as individuals? From a self-directed learning perspective, it suggests that while you're in this situation, you can still develop a plan to engage others who might have perhaps more experience with remote teams. People who can help. You might share articles with a subset of people that are in the same boat as you. You might segment the issues that you need to learn about. So whether that is engagement or evaluation or communication, maybe there's something to be learned about each one of those points. So the more experience you get with dealing with remote teams, the better you will be. And having learning goals that you create through this self-directed process can certainly be important. I think at the very least, self-directed learning, it forces all of us to be honest with ourselves about what we're doing well and where we need improvement. It engages us to fit our learning plan to both our current needs and also our future needs.
Thanks, Deb. And my next question is around the competencies that you mentioned. You mentioned there were 50 of them and that it wasn't comprehensive. Well, I think 50 is quite a few to start with, as I'm sure that was why you stopped there. But, how does a manager, or anyone for that matter, know what competencies or behavioral skills are most important for them in their job or their daily life? And, I think you started to talk about this, but how should we think about these competencies differently in a crisis?
Sure, absolutely. Well, we talked about self-assessment, as I mentioned earlier, but don't stop there, because especially now, I think we need to have confidence in ourselves to open up and ask others for input. So engage your manager, ask your peers, engage your direct reports. I may think that I'm an effective communicator or a good presenter, but someone who's on the receiving end of one of my communications or my presentation may have some constructive feedback for me about, something that I don't have the perspective to see. And I'll give you an example here. I was asked by a direct report a number of years ago to give them some feedback after they made an important presentation to fellow senior managers. And I responded by saying, listen, your content was spot on. You did a great presentation from the content and what people needed to know. But let me tell you a little bit about the style of the presentation and the fact that some of the things in the presentation may have actually detracted from the content that you were trying to present. And this individual was sort of taken aback a little bit because they thought, I've done what you asked me to do, which was present great content. But my point was, you might not have seen what the reaction was that others were having. And so while we all can critique ourselves, inviting others to give us some input. So what might you do now in terms of competencies, thinking differently in this time of crisis? Absolutely, because right now, all of those things that you either thought you were good at or things that you may not have paid as close attention to are much more important. I was on a video meeting a few days ago, and it was a small group, and we all knew each other pretty well. And one of the other individuals said, "Hey, Deb, your camera is showing you blurry. Can you fix your?" And she told me some technical term. And then in the chat box, went ahead and told me how to fix that. And I fixed it. And it was interesting because now that she could see me more clearly, it was almost like she could hear me more clearly. And I think that's a perfect example today of we may not always realize. And so you've got to be open and confident and ask for input about what's important to you right now and how can I help?
I love that, Deb. I'm just trying to say thank you, an extra thank you to everybody who does things for us. I know we're all very busy and uh, trying to trying to respond to everything as well as we can. But I've been trying just to take the time just to say thank you and be really grateful
Great
because I think
point.
it makes a big difference in this time of crisis. We're going to take a short break for some quick announcements and be back in just a minute to continue this really interesting conversation with Deb Cohen on the book Developing Management Proficiency and why it's especially relevant during COVID-19.
Can you, your team, or your company benefit from insights such as the ones provided in this podcast? They are immediately available when you join the Conference Board, a membership-based think tank that delivers trusted insights for what's ahead. Reaching across industries and geographies, we bring together our noted experts, senior executives from the world's largest companies, and nonpartisan practical research to help you address your most important business issues. Our membership packages are tailored to your organization's unique needs and budget. To learn more about our offerings, go to www.conferenceboard.org and click Join on the top bar to connect with one of our product specialists.
Hello, and welcome back to our conversation with Deb Cohen on the book Developing Management Proficiency, which I think is particularly compelling right now during the COVID-19 crisis. Deb, one of your chapters focuses on the art of observation, and I know that your book will be used this fall by MBA students. But now, with so many of us working from home or going to school from home, how can we use observation to help us with our management skills?
Yeah, I think observation is something that's critically important, and it's why I'm very glad that it's being included in an MBA class, because you've got to learn this skill early on. And you might say to yourself, well, why is observation important now? Because so many people are, working at home. But observation isn't just watching a person real time. Observation is something that we often take for granted in terms of what we're seeing. And I actually just wrote an article that I posted on LinkedIn earlier this week, and also on the website for my book, that basically challenges ourselves in the coming weeks to be much more observant, given what's been such a drastic change in operations for many of us. When we think about management competencies and we think about management skill, it's also about being cognizant of our environment. And so I've actually put out there a challenge. And what I've suggested is that people start to take notes, that they start to reflect on what they see in virtual meetings and what they see in virtual communications. So, for example, who has their camera on? What are they doing while the virtual meeting is being conducted? Take a look at more thoughtfully at how your emails are structured. Who uses caps? Who doesn't? Who starts the sentence with all those little things which you might think are maybe silly or inconsequential. They actually have an impact on what people are seeing and reading and feeling. So you need to look for things like, are there differences in frequency of emails? Are there differences in tone? Same thing again with the virtual meetings that you might be having. So my point is today that it may be, or people might be trying to be business as usual in concept, but it's not necessarily behavior as usual. So are you communicating as effectively as you need? Are your employees engaged and are they motivated? And what are some of those differences? Are communications coming from the organization, not just you? Are they as effective and clear as they need to be? If we think back to what we said about the trust barometer, you as a manager have to be looking at communications that are coming from your organization so that you can help explain that to your employees and make sure that your employees are understanding. So management skills and management effectiveness are critically important, and observation is a way to really check in on how we're being perceived, how you think your employees are doing, and most importantly, as a structured way of helping us improve our own behavior. So take my example before when somebody told me that my picture was coming through blurry, and my learning from that was that the way I look on camera also impacts the way people are understanding me and interacting with me.
That's very good advice, Deb. I completely concur with everything you just said. And you mentioned note taking, and that actually ties right in with my next question, which is I was intrigued by the chapter you wrote on the art of journaling. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Simply because I think journaling may feel scary to a lot of people, myself included.
Sure, no problem at all. So journaling is a way to, sort of take in what we observe and think about behavior, both our own behavior and other behaviors, and put it down for two reasons. One, to remember what happened, and two, to reflect. I suspect that you've been in a position where, I know I have, where you were in a meeting or making a presentation and you thought, Deb's reaction was really interesting. I need to remember that and talk to her about it. Or that was an incredibly effective way for John to handle pushback from a client or a customer, or even a subordinate. How do I make sense of that reaction and how do I capture it? So, I think journaling helps us. It helps us organize our thoughts. It helps us plan for not just further learning, but for follow-up. And most importantly, it helps us look for patterns. And as for it being scary, I'm going to suggest that maybe it's more uncomfortable than it is something to be feared. The reality is that journaling can be as simple as, writing something down, bullet points. It doesn't have to be like the diary that, you think of when you were a kid, or even some people who do as adults right now. But it could be as simple as setting up a file in your tablet or your phone where you can take notes and put down some bullet points. All of us take notes, or some of us do anyway, take notes during a meeting. And when we do that, we're doing it because we want to be more productive. We want clarity about what is expected of us. So think of journaling as a natural progression from note taking, that you can use it as a way to focus on personal development, not just on for productivity or for clarity. Clarity is a management skill, and journaling helps us with that clarity. So I encourage you not to be scared or fearful, but and frankly, the more you do it, the more comfortable you're going to get with it, and the more valuable you're going to find out that it is.
I like that because I do take meetings during notes. I just don't think of it as journaling. So perhaps I should start to think about being a little bit more, maybe use a different color ink or something for the reflective parts. One of the things that we are told all the time in consulting is to build your network. And in fact, I think it's said so often that some people just roll their eyes when they hear it because, for some people, building their network is just getting more contacts on LinkedIn. But I actually don't think that's what it means. But I do believe that networking is going to be a little bit more challenging during a crisis like this one, where we're all being encouraged or told to stay home. So how can we network for learning if we're not going to typical networking events or able to meet face-to-face with people?
Boy, that's a great question, Robin. Thank you. First of all, let me say I've been a huge believer in networking since the start of my career. In fact, I have a friend who calls me the Kevin Bacon of HR, and she tells me that she almost always either meets somebody or knows somebody within 4 or 5 degrees of separation who knows me. So it's something that we joke about, but the reality is that I've been conscious about building my network for decades. And the reason why I think this is important, and it goes to your point, is that networking is not, you shouldn't do it just when you need it. You should do it always, because when you need it, then you'll have your network. Old-fashioned way you used to think about going to places to do that networking. But today, I think, especially, I think we actually have an incredible opportunity. We have resources that we've never had before that allow us to network both virtually and in person. So when somebody asks you to join a network platform like LinkedIn, as you mentioned, or even send you a direct email to inquire, you're actually networking. So you can network virtually, not just in person. I'd say that our current situation does give us this opportunity to actually go a little bit deeper. So let's say, for example, you have an event that was canceled, or that meeting was actually moved to be a virtual event, and you think, well, I'm just going to be listening to that speaker. I'm not actually going to be interacting not only with the speaker, but with the people around me. Well, now you have this opportunity, after you listen to that event, to actually reach out directly to that speaker or reach out to the organizers. take some time to engage that person in a question and say, gosh, I'm sorry I didn't meet you face to face, but I'd really like more information about, X, Y, or Z that you mentioned during the presentation. Everyone is dealing with things being atypical at the moment and frankly, in the months ahead. So I would look at this as an opportunity to do networking in a more targeted way and to engage in deeper conversations. I'll give you an example. I received a note from somebody from the Middle East earlier this week, and they said they found themselves, as you mentioned, with some time on their hands, and they read my book and they wanted to connect with me, and we've corresponded a couple times now. And, it's been fascinating, and I certainly hope that people would do that regardless of whether they met me face to face. But I think we're going to see this more and more. I think it's not just an opportunity when you see somebody, but take that opportunity now. Once you connect with people, you can use a self-directed learning approach. It's really natural that you can ask deeper questions. You can test out your own ideas. I think a lot of people are very generous when it comes to helping others. And I think it's especially true now during these difficult times. And so it's a way, as you said, Robin, you've been saying thank you to a lot of people. Well, absolutely. And I think that deeper interaction is another way to say thank you. And yes, I'm listening. So networking, critically important. And especially as people start to transition, don't wait until things, quote unquote, get better. Network now. It's important.
I completely agree with you. In fact, I'd even add one more suggestion for folks, which is if you're trying to network deliberately, think about what you might be able to offer.
Absolutely.
Not just to ask for an introduction or a connection or want to be connected. Those are very good reasons to get in touch with people. But whenever you can, think about, how you can maybe help that person, something that you've seen, maybe that they hadn't seen, or, something that's relevant to what the conversation is. Always think about what you can provide as well.
Yeah, I agree 100%. Thank you.
Yeah. So for a little bit of levity here, I had to laugh when I read the chapter about doing role play and how you can do it by yourself in the shower or the car. A lot of us aren't in our cars that much these days, but we hopefully are all showering. So tell me a little bit more about how role play can be useful in developing management proficiency, especially for those of us whose last acting opportunities were many years ago when we were actually children.
All right, I'm going to go out on a limb here, Robin, and say that you've probably had an interaction with someone, whether that's a peer, a subordinate, a boss, a sibling, a significant other, where you said in your head, gosh, I wish I could have a do-over. I mean, I certainly have had that. And I think throughout your career, you've probably had that. I would have liked to have said X, or I would have liked to have done Y. And if you're like me, when that happened, what I've tried to do is prepare a bit differently for the next interaction with that person or over that situation. To continue with the levity here, when I was a freshman in college, I took a lot of speech communication courses. And this was a long time ago, I have to admit. And it was before PowerPoint slides. And it was a time when your assignment might have been something like, give me a 5-minute speech to persuade. Well, my suite mates hated it on the days when my speeches were due because my MO was to write the speech and to memorize it. But the shower, that's where I practiced my intonations, my hand gestures, my pauses. And so, of course, I would take very lengthy showers. And I didn't know it at the time, but what I was actually doing was a form of role play. And, I suspect that most of us have taken a training course where we were asked to role play with another participant. In fact, role play, it's really a proven and effective way to learn. But we don't always have an opportunity to role play with somebody or to get feedback. And what I think is really important is the practice. If you're about to get on the call with somebody, with a client or with a meeting with an employee, and if you think the issue or the topic is sensitive in some way, you can really, I think, help your effectiveness by playing that conversation out, not just in your head, but actually out loud. Saying the words out loud, sometimes writing down possible reactions that you might get, and then practicing or preparing responses in a self-directed way that is helping you to prepare for that actual conversation. It's great to play out in our head, and we all do it, but speaking the part makes the role play, and similar to journaling, I think it's nothing to be afraid of. It it helps us power through that discomfort of maybe the actual conversation by talking to yourself. As a result, I think it can really help you be more effective in your delivery and make better choices in terms of your words and your reactions. So when we get back into our cars and we're heading to work, let people think that you're singing along to the radio and practice that next conversation that you're going to have. And before you get on your next video call, practice what you want to say, especially if it's a sensitive issue.
That's all really good advice, Deb. And I was glad you clarified that in the showers you were practicing your hand gestures, because I really was curious about the waterproof paper that you were using in the shower to rehearse. So one final question for you. And it's an interesting topic, especially now as we're contemplating what life will look like as we go forward post the pandemic. And I think the world will change. I think there'll be, to quote an oft-used phrase, another new normal for us. So my question is, do you think there's still a place for face-to-face training and other traditional professional development opportunities? What do you think will happen to face-to-face learning going forward? And also maybe you could put in a plug about the report we've been writing on alternative credentialing as well.
Sure, absolutely. Well, first of all, I absolutely think that there is a place for face-to-face training and other traditional professional development opportunities. Excuse me. Years ago, when a lot of learning began to go online, there were lots of predictions that most training would migrate online. I disagreed then, and I disagree now. I think there is a huge opportunity for learning online. I think delivery and effectiveness have gotten much better. I mean, look at the podcast series that you folks are doing. It's a great opportunity for people to listen and to learn. But I don't think that we're going to get away from or replace human interaction. I think right now, for example, people are actually craving social interaction while practicing physical distancing. So I think we're seeing virtual meetings and even virtual happy hours that people are able to absorb and learn through the interaction. But there's always, I think, going to be this desire to provide effective ways of learning in a face-to-face way. I think online learning has its place, and I think it's going to continue to be in demand. But I also think that traditional professional development will continue. I think it will come back. I think we're going to have conferences and training sessions. I've delivered training and education both face-to-face and virtually. And in virtual settings, I've done it both synchronously and asynchronously. And I think that each one of those modes has its strengths and its challenges. And I'm going to admit that my bias is for face-to-face professional development, because I think it's never going to cease to be important, because I think as humans, we're never going to want to do all of our learning without that face-to-face interaction. Self-directed learning has elements of individual learning, as we've talked about, but I think it blends quite well with traditional learning. So I didn't write the book to put myself out of business, because I think that the two approaches certainly go hand in hand. And as for the report that we're writing on alternative credentials, I think that's a great point. In that report, we talk about the fact that people are getting certificates and certifications, and they're getting micro credentials. There's boot camps. There's all sorts of things that people are doing. A lot of it's online. Some of it is face-to-face. The point is that people are going beyond that 4-year degree, or perhaps if they don't have that 4-year degree, they're showing their qualifications in different ways. And just as we say in the report that employers really need to be open to looking at alternative credentials, not just the traditional 4-year degree, I think we all need to be open to how people learn, and the fact that professional development comes in many shapes and sizes, and that we as business leaders and organizations need to be open to how is education occurring and how are we communicating and what's going to be important. And there's a lot that we can do both individually from a self-directed way and organizationally as we support our employees and as managers, as we develop our own skills and we help our employees and our peers and our fellow workers to develop their competencies and their skills. So thank you for asking about that, because I think it's really important, especially in this whole realm of management and behavioral skills.
I agree, Deb, and thanks for that discussion about traditional face-to-face learning and the importance of self-directed learning and the concept of alternative credentials. And I look forward to doing another podcast with you when we're actually able to publish that report. So that will be fun. But thank you so much for your time today. I learned so much from your book, and I've already recommended it to a few friends who I know are working on their management skills at different levels. And so if any of you are interested in purchasing the book, Developing Management Proficiency, it's available through Amazon and other major booksellers. In addition, Deb has created a website with additional resources at www.developingmanagementproficiency.com. And if you've enjoyed this episode, please remember to subscribe to our off-the-shelf book discussion podcast series, or explore the entire catalog of podcast programming from the Conference Board by visiting our website at www.conference-board.org/podcasts. Thank you so much for your time today.